Hello guys, welcome back to another Elden Ring build video. Today we're going to be taking a look at my DEATH JESTER build, which actually serves as a multi-weapon template that makes use of certain weapons that can function optimally within a Strength Arcane hybrid, specifically 45 Arcane higher strength value, which gives us access not only to some of the strongest bleed specializations in the game, but offering us extremely solid non-bleed loadouts for enemies that are either resistant to bleed, or you simply just don't like using bleed, but do like some of the weapons that require a Strength Arcane split, such as some of the new DLC weapons like the Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword. So first I'll go over the stats for the template before going over my recommended weapon and talisman loadouts that will shine with it. So this is a 150 build in New Game Plus, not to say that you need to be a New Game Plus to play it, on the contrary, it's more of a point of emphasis on how well this build performs. You'll notice at a glance we have lower than average vigor at 40 points. You might also have noticed in the footage that I'm wearing 4 pieces of the Rakshasa armor, and no hitting bosses is what I enjoy trying to do, so I play very glass cannon, but don't worry, this build can be adjusted to be more defensive, which I will go over. I don't even overinvest in this glass cannon concept myself. For example, we still do have 40 points in vigor because as this is a multi-weapon template, it needs to be capable of switching between glass cannon and more defensive, as some weapons are designed more to trade hits with the enemy, and this can be done by switching your armor and talismans and even defensive consumables. That said, if you wanted to bump your vigor up to 50 and sacrifice 10 points in strength, you could do that, but I'd recommend relying on armor and talismans and consumables for that direct damage negation. 20 mind is a comfortable FP bar, even on something like a Lion's Claw spam build. 30 endurance is the minimum I'd go to, considering I like to run with colossal weapons and have multiple active weapons on me. You will have to throw on an Arsenal Jar talisman when wielding colossals, but in a stat distribution like this, a talisman slot sacrifice is a lot better than the amount of points needed in stamina in order to forego an Arsenal Jar talisman. And likewise, we don't want to go below 30 stamina because there are plenty of weapons that fit within this template where the talisman slot is needed and 30 stamina is just enough to wield that weapon without something like a Great Jar's Arsenal. Strength is 62 simply because this is what we're left with after meeting the minimum requirements elsewhere. If any stat would get further point priority, it would be strength, but 62 is a decent investment, especially when two-handing and getting that 1.5 times strength modifier. Dex is at 15, as that's the max amount I need for all of the weapons that I use and will talk about, with the exception of one being the Great Katana, which has a Dex requirement of 18. I just throw on a Dex talisman when I want to use that weapon, which obviously isn't ideal, but I also do not use the weapon a lot, so keep that in mind. If the Great Katana is a weapon that you want to use frequently, you might want to put 18 points in Dex. Intelligence and Faith is as low as the starting class will enable. Keep in mind that Faith in most builds is one of the most essential ways of accessing your offensive and defensive utilities through incantations, but that isn't needed in this template for reasons I will go over shortly. For Arcane, we are stopping at 45. The weapons intended to work with this template, whilst in many cases scale with Arcane, it's always going to be Arcane as a secondary scaler. Strength is always going to be the priority scaling stat, but 45 Arcane is your soft cap for accumulation of certain statuses such as bleed, poison, sleep and madness, provided the weapon scales with Arcane either natively or via affinity switching. So this template works perfectly for any weapon that primarily scales with strength but has Arcane scaling of some form on the weapon alongside one of the 4 statuses mentioned. In terms of your ideal weapons, there is quite a large pool to choose from. There are many weapons that are strength based that will scale perfectly once set to an occult affinity or a bleed affinity, but I'll go over some of my favorites, starting with your ideal bleed setups, for which I have 2 major recommendations. Those being the Beastman Curve Sword set to Blood Affinity with Seppuku Ash of War, and also the Gargoyle's Twin Blades with Blood Affinity and Seppuku. The Gargoyle's Twin Blades are going to offer you a higher AR and blood loss build up on paper, but I personally much prefer the Beastman's Curve Swords, as in practice they just have a much faster moveset and generally just feel a lot less clunky in terms of stamina management and animation recovery. As with most bleed builds, people might want to choose to run with the Raptor's Black Feathers and White Mask. Personally, I don't, because as mentioned, I'm running 4-piece Rakshasas, which is a massive attack power boost at the cost of damage negation, and I could be using the White Mask in the head slot, but equally I could just be running the 5th piece of the Rakshasa armor, but I'm wearing the Sage Hood purely for fashion. Your talismans, however, will be your standard bleed setup, consisting of the Lords of Blood Exaltation to proc AP buff on proximity blood loss, the Rotten Winged Sword insignia for AP buff on successive attacks, and the jump attacks on Beastman Curve Swords and Gargoyle Twin Blades will be proccing this efficiently. We also have the Claw Talisman to enhance those jump attacks, and then this last slot is what depends on if you're running the Glass Cannon or defensive variants of the build. Ritual Sword Talisman is a 10% AP increase as long as you're at 100% 10% health at the cost of heavy damage negation. So in combination with the Rakshas's armor, you're getting 2-shot in a lot of situations. So if you don't want to play like that, firstly, don't run the Rakshas's armor. Wear anything you want that meets the requirements of at least a 51 poise breakpoint, and then swap this talisman out for the Dragon Crest Greatshield talisman, which is going to offer you some fairly decent physical damage negation. The physic mix I run on the bleed setup is a little unique to others because I'm not focused on stance break or maximizing AR. I tend to go for utility, so I run the Windy Crystal tier, which gives more iframes on your dodge roll for 3 minutes, and then depending on how comfortable I am with the boss's moveset, I'll either use a deflecting hard tier to perfect guard, or if I'm a little less confident against the boss, then I'll just go all in on damage with a Thorny Crack tier, which will stack with your Rotten Winged insignia, enhancing your consecutive attacks. Now, if you wanted to be super sweaty, but want to go literally all in on the glass cannon element, then there is the Blood-Sucking Crack tier, which is a very nice damage boost, but you're essentially signing up to the fact that if you get hit, you are going to die. So what happens when we're against bleed resistant bosses? Well, this template allows us to have access to some of the highest AR and stance break and no skill required playstyles in the game, such as an occult scaled Giant Crusher with Lion's Claw, and I mean Lion's Claw specifically, not the new Savage Lion's Claw Ash of War, which I do use on another weapon, but on the Giant's Crusher, the base Lion's Claw is going to be the most efficient in terms of stance break. Occult scaling is going to give you a B scaling in Strength and a B scaling in Arcane, but you also have the option to switch to a heavy affinity in rare cases where a boss is super weak to a specific element that you can then apply via a Drawstring Grease, which is my go-to to absolutely bully commander guys. And with a Thorny Crack tier in your physic mix, it only takes 2 Lion's Claws to break its stance. You can even optimize this build around critical damage in situations like that. So my build setup for the Giant Crusher would look something like this in general: an occult affinity scaled Giant Crusher with the Lion's Claw Ash of War, 4-piece Rakshasa as always, and then for the talismans we do need that Great Jar's Arsenal for that medium load with this weapon, Shard of Alexander to increase the damage of Lion's Claw, Ritual Sword Talisman or Dragon Crest Talisman depending on if you want to be offensive or defensive, and then in this last slot you actually have a lot of options here. If you plan on using your light and heavy moveset with the weapon, then I would recommend the Two-Handed Sword Talisman. However, this has 0 value on Lion's Claw, so if you want to spam Lion's Claw, I'd actually swap this out for the Dagger Talisman, as you're going to be breaking stances left and right, and this is just going to be a huge boost for capitalizing on that. If however you're a little all over the place, you know, you're doing jump attacks, light attacks, Lion's Claw, you might want to consider the Two-Headed Turtle Talisman, as obviously the weapon is very heavy and swinging it around willy-nilly is going to get you caught with your pants down when you run out of stamina. So for the physic mix here, your best in slot is absolutely going to be the Stone Barbed Crack tier, as breaking stances is the central focus of this playstyle. The other slot is entirely optional. I find having even as little as 5 more iframes on your dodge roll to be absolutely huge, so I tend to always run with the Windy Crystal tier. Sticking with the colossal weapons, you also have the new Ancient Meteoric Ore Greatsword, which is a super cool weapon. It has a crouch poke and thrusting heavy, similar to my 2 favorite weapons in the game being the Zweihander and the Claymore, but its unique skill, White Light Charge, is super awesome, having a fairly long range gap closer thrusting attack, which can be detonated with a second press of the button that sees you sort of like detonate an explosive aura that is very short radius. However, if it impacts, it's going to be doing decent damage but incredible stance damage, and on human sized enemies the initial thrust will stagger them and then the detonation will just send them flying, which includes bosses like Melania. So overall it's just a very cool weapon, and just aesthetically it's probably one of my favorite weapons purely on the aesthetics alone. I mean, just look at it. But for the talismans with this weapon, you can run this the exact same way as the Lion's Claw Giant Crusher if you intend to just spam the Ash of War, though personally I tend to use the moveset on this weapon a lot more, such as the crouch poke and the heavy. So I do slot in the Two-Handed Sword Talisman. Just again keep in mind that this is going to have 0 effect on your Ash of War. Again, I would recommend the Stone Barb Crack tier with this weapon, as White Light Charge alongside jumping attacks and heavies on colossal swords in general are just super good at breaking stances. So the last colossal I'll mention is of course the Greatsword, aka the Guts Greatsword, as in this template it's super fun to give this weapon the bleed affinity, and this is where I throw on a Savage Lion's Claw for some super fun results, because you've got that fat AR, you have the stance damage of the weapon itself, plus the ability to proc bleed now, while spamming this crazy combo with hyper armor in Savage Lion's Claw. Though do keep in mind, this is the kind of playstyle where you should expect to be trading hits with the enemy, you know, because it's a super long animation, and like you do have that hyper armor, but you're going to get hit in it. And as such, the glass cannon variant of this build probably isn't the best idea. So for this one, I would recommend switching your armor to look a little something like this, with the Knight Cavalry chest piece, Gauntlets of Solitude, and the Knight Cavalry Greaves. and that way we're hitting like 54 poise, which is above our minimum 51 poise recommendation. We look super cool, matching that guts theme very well, and we have our Great Jar's Arsenal, Shard of Alexander to boost Savage Lion's Claw, a Dragon Crest Talisman to help mitigate damage when trading hits through that hyper armor, and then that last slot is optional, but I personally would recommend the two-headed Turtle Talisman. So now you have an idea of some basic setups. I'll mention some more weapons that I recommend just without going into detail. So you can use weapons such as the Great Star Hammer with Blood Affinity. Dual wielding these with double Crag Blade and focused on jumping attacks is actually disgusting in terms of raw damage and bleed and stance break. This is one of my go-to setups if I feel like beating the crap out of Millennia. You can run a Blood Affinity Knight Rider's Glaive with Phantom Slash, a tried and tested combo that slots perfectly into this template. You can even run status detonation builds with some of the new Ashes of War. For example, carrying a Serpent Bow, sort of like a sidearm to proc poison very quickly, and then detonate that poison with the new Ash of War. The Poison Flower blooms twice. It definitely feels a little bit gimmicky, but equally it's also a very new feeling playstyle. It feels very fresh. I really enjoyed playing this setup. You have your very popular Executioner's Greatsword, of course, which is a Strength Arcane weapon. You can even have a Heavy Affinity Great Katana that can then be infused via Drawstring Greases, which again is an example of a playstyle or weapon that isn't going to be perfectly optimized with this template, but the template still allows you to play it effectively, you know? So you have a lot of options, and it's like you can be very flexible with this template. In terms of your buff routines, there are some things I recommend doing now that the DLC enables us to gather more bell bearings. All of the consumables I use for buffs can have almost all of their materials purchased now without having to collect every single material, and this is done by collecting all of the bell bearings from the pots that are scattered all around the world, which you can find many guides on YouTube for, and that will just make things like Blood Boil Aromatics and Drawstring Greases abundant and easily farmable for you, so I do suggest doing that. I'm not a player who likes a hefty buff routine. I also don't like one-shot builds, so whilst I like being strong, I also like playing the actual game. So for me, it's about spending 5 or so seconds, popping 1 or 2 consumables, then maybe the Ash of War if it's a weapon buff like Seppuku, and the most bang for your buck in terms of DPS consumables is going to be your Blood Boil Aromatic. However, I also carry a hefty stack of Exalted Flesh because these do not stack with the Blood Boil Aromatics, but there are situations where I don't want to use a Blood Boil Aromatic because they're a little bit more expensive. So, you know, like against an elite mob, not so much a major boss encounter, I'll use an Exalted Flesh, but against major encounters, Blood Boil Aromatic is my main consumable. We of course have our Physic Flask, and then if we're running a bleed variant, we're going to need to proc Seppuku on both weapons, and we do that by first two-handing our left weapon, buff with Seppuku, and then we switch back into dual wield, press Seppuku again, and this will buff our right weapon, and we're ready to go. Now, if we're running a defensive setup, the only thing I'd throw in here is a Boiled Crab, and maybe be running some defensive mixtures in my Physic mix, but remember, this is just me. There are loads of different consumables that will give you Golden Vow, Proc Madness, which can then be synergized with Talisman swapping, etc. But like I said, I like to keep it simple. And as you've seen, even in New Game Plus Plus at 150, this build is just shredding absolutely everything without needing an extensive buff routine. So next I'll go over the utility essentials I carry with me at all times. Firstly, the Misery Cord, specifically for critical hits. And I have this attuned to Fire Affinity with this template, as the combination of C strength scaling with the split damage of the physical and fire, in most cases, is going to be a bigger damage increase on single hit, which is generally what you're going to be going for when doing criticals, over something like a heavy infusion, which will give you B strength scaling, but without that fire, that single hit of damage is going to be less than that split damage. So though do keep in mind, it's not always the case that switching to the Misery Cord is going to be doing more critical damage than whatever weapon you're using, due to how well whatever weapon you're using might be scaling with Arcane or Strength versus the Misery Cord. So you might want to do some testing yourself if you want to be super optimized, but in most cases, switching to the Misery Cord will be the best way to maximize your crit damage on stance break. I carry a bow, in this case mostly the Serpent Bow, due to the fact that it has innate arcane scaling, which is ideal when using status arrows. I don't often use pots except on like very specific boss encounters, but I do often use Drawstring Greases, particularly on heavy infused weapons versus enemies highly weak to a particular element or status. Now, another thing you should always carry in your back inventory is any weapon with the Sacred Blade Ash of War. This is a super underutilized Ash of War. Not only is this an obvious counter to undead enemies that prevents their resurrection on kill, but it actually does surprisingly good damage in general, given the fact that this build has absolutely nothing to do with Faith or Holy scaling, and the Ash of War offers more utility in terms of efficiency than a ranged weapon in a lot of cases. It's an extremely useful tool to have on hand when dealing with anything giving you a headache from a medium or elevated distance. Now beyond that, I don't think there's much more to say. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask them down in the comments, and then I'll try to respond to them as soon as possible. Keep an eye on the pinned comment for any updates to this build. you're also welcome to join our Discord for trading and co-op or general chat. The link will also be provided in the pinned comment and description. If you liked this video, please hit the like button as that really helps me out. And if you're not already subscribed, consider subscribing for more Elden Ring content coming soon. Okay guys, until next time, take care.